Perhaps you saw this headline this past week: sealed French love letters read for the first time in 265 years. Maybe you saw that this chest of letters that was uncovered by the British archives was suddenly unveiled by historians, and these letters were written around 1758 in what was being named that 7 Years' War. Now, I had to go to my history because on this shore, we often call it the French and Indian War. It's a matter of perspective. At that time, we were still part of the British colonies. And so it was in this stretch of time when there was ongoing fight for what was at that time known to be colonial territory. Of course, we know that there were others occupying these shores. But these letters are rare in that they provide a glimpse of uncertain life at that time, in the time of war, largely written by those of lower classes, reaching out to soldiers who are, they're expressing their sorrows, their hopes, their longing, and all of this from wives and siblings, parents and girlfriends, those unsure if they would see their loved ones again. All these years, friends, 265 in a box in the archives in Britain. And so what do some of the flavor of these letters tell us, except things like what Marie de Bosque wrote to her husband? Can you imagine it as the late night was coming and she was longing to be with him? I could spend the night writing to you, perhaps by candlelight, I imagine. I am your forever faithful wife. Good night, my dear friend. It is midnight. I think it is time for me to rest. Can you imagine these historians reading these letters for the first time, almost like you've stumbled across someone's journal that you aren't supposed to be in, but nonetheless, you can't stop reading for posterity as much as for your own intrigue. At the time of Marie de Bosque's writing, she didn't know that her husband's ship, the Galate, had been captured on its way to Canada. And these 100-some letters or so had never reached those recipients because those soldiers were likely scattered into prisons across England. But they endured a day somehow. We know that so many letters have been lost to time, but these endure to share with us a moment in history and to unpack something that we didn't know that we were yearning to know. Now, we sometimes know that these letters are filled with these words of love, and sometimes that love comes by way of encouragement and admonishment and nudging. So that's how we arrive at 1 Corinthians today. Yes, yes. As we look at 1 Corinthians today, we know that we don't have all of Paul's letters that he was blanketing across the Mediterranean region, writing 1,700 years before the French letters that we were just talking about. I think it's just ongoingly astonishing that we have these letters that do come to us through the Christian epistles. They were copied and copied and copied again with the belief that there was something deeply important to pass on, and they have not been limbo or lost, at least the ones that we have. It's a miracle this love persists. In his writing, Paul is capable of a caring tone, but he is unafraid to point out the struggles that are faced in relationships. He does so in this letter today. We don't have the entirety of chapter 13 here, but you recognize those pieces. Perhaps they're very familiar sounding to you. Corinth is a place where Paul had spent 18 months establishing connections prior in his missionary journeys. And this is a community that has been established for a while, and Paul feels that he can be honest with them, honest about the pain that he feels and the reports about their current state. This love passage is often selected for what kind of occasion? But for weddings. Verses to be read with joining two people in marriage. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to feel good about this contract that we're entering into. But if anything, the true context of this story tells us that this letter is more like marriage counseling than any inaugural wedding blessing. He is writing to a committed group of believers that are finding all kinds of ways to treat each other poorly, who need to have an unpacking of what love is because they seem to have forgotten. They have an abundance of potential spiritual gifts. We know, as we said last week, they have them aplenty, but they are allowing their wealth and status to outweigh their consideration of each other as equals in Christ. Chapter 13, above all, is a heart and a gut check. Do we know this true to be that even as we think to those who've gone on before, there are sometimes complicated realities of our relationships. It can be hard to remember, especially thinking about a later stage in one's own marriage. It's hard to remember when burdens and sickness and children and new social and financial challenges come, the strain that puts in limbo that strong connection, the kind of love that can endure these things even when a marriage ends, or when there's new ways of being in contact. It's here that Paul is addressing the for worse part of churching, the for better and the for worse. Paul, in his beautiful words of love, is calling the Corinthians to remember themselves, to remember their foundation founded in the love of Christ, what draws them together. And his love letter is a poetic plea. Here are all things that love doesn't do, as Lois said, what love isn't. He speaks to people in division, opens up the ways in which we know that we manipulate that love or act out of what we think is love, but might be something else. So often, we only have our own well-being in mind. We perhaps know the sting when love causes us to divide allegiances, when love means excluding some aspect of who we are in order to follow another, when love leads to warfare, when warfare separates us from those we love. We see many examples across the world right very now, perhaps in Ukraine and Gaza and so many other places in which love letters aren't making their way, or they're put in a post box with a prayer. We know that love for country, love of tribe, all of the things that might draw us together, so too can also drive us so very much apart. When the historian who got to read these letters from the French for the first time, never having been opened in 265 years, he said, "When we are separated from loved ones by events beyond our control, like the pandemic or wars, we have to work out how to stay in touch, how to reassure, care for people, and keep the passion alive. Today we have Zoom and WhatsApp, and thank goodness we do, friends. But in the 18th century, people only had letters, but what they wrote about feels very familiar." Now we do know that Marie de Bosque didn't get the chance to see her husband again. She died a year after that letter was written, before he was released from prison. We know sometimes our intended words, our intended thoughts, hopes, and dreams do not meet their destination. But friends, there is the reminder that comes through Paul of love's enduring. Sometimes, as it says in that chapter, we only see in a mirror but dimly. But we know in the completion and the wholeness of time, yes, indeed, in God's time, we will know and see more brightly. I'm reminded of Art's story of his father who did die in battle, but whose light and love and those words in that letter yet remain. Friends, in a moment, we will come to our table of light. We will remember especially those of the community of saints who have died in this past year. We know their legacy is with us. We know that each of you carry the legacy and light of all of those who have gone on before and continue to contribute to your journeys. In the All Saints celebration, we revel in the mercy of light, knowing, I think, that each one of these lights is a love letter unto the beyond. For I think that the beauty that we understand through these written words and through the words that remain are ways in which the saints can yet reach out to us and inscribe upon us those letters of love, those words that help us to endure for this time and for this place, even though we yet see dimly. And so we are inspired here, not because it's easy, but because love in its persistence is not arrogant or rude, but it's patient, it's kind. So as we come to the table today, perhaps you have those words that have stirred on you in the remembrance of those letters that you have, those that are more challenging, and those that warm our hearts and bring tears to our eyes. We give thanks in the tradition of the Dia de los Muertos, in the tradition of what it means to come to the changing of the season as winter would come, that this is a time in which we need more light as the darkness, as we learn so much from the mystery of God's love into the winter season. We give thanks of a persistence that comes and the persistence that also comes in Christ.